Did Jennifer Soto really not know what was happening to Madeline? Look at these three faces. Just really look at them for a second. On one side, you have Stearns. He's been found guilty of the unthinkable, crimes that, honestly, as a therapist, are some of the most difficult to even categorize. And on the other side, you have Jenn Soto, the mother, the person who, through every interview and every police interaction, clung to the single devastating narrative. I lived in the dark. I had no idea. And then, in the middle of it all, is the heartbreaking truth of the vulnerable victim, Madeline Soto. When I first saw these images side by side in the case file, I actually had to stop. I had to just sit back in my chair and take a breath because from a clinical perspective, the math just didn't add up. It didn't make sense. There's a complete pattern interrupt here between Stearns and Jennifer. On one side, you see the guilty and stoic person. His face is stoic. Then you see Jenn, who said that she lived in the dark. You have the predator, and then you have perhaps the silent enabler. And that clinical math just does not add up. Why stay silent? I want to be very clear here. Jenn Soto was not charged or found guilty for anything that happened to Madeline. Jenn has denied prior knowledge of what happened to her daughter, and officials have not pursued charges against her based on the evidence reviewed. Jenn's actions or inactions are only my speculations. And at the time of this video, no legal action has taken place. I'm simply addressing the massive public speculations here. In my therapy practice, I look for patterns. I look for a cause and effect. And here, that equation was broken. People will look at the photos and they'll see the monster and the victim. They'll see a predator and a grieving mother. But when I look at them through a clinical lens, I see something way more complex and, frankly, more unsettling. I see the mutual delusion. One provides the horror, the other provides the silence, and then it creates an unspoken, devastating psychological contract. The predator and the enabler were in the same house. It's the most devastating partnership that happens behind closed doors. And today, we're going to look at how that dynamic was built slowly, brick by brick. As a licensed professional counselor, I have spent years sitting across from people who are trying to make sense of the unthinkable. And when I look at the footage of Stearns and Jenn, I don't just see a tragedy. I don't just see a bad situation. I see a textbook example of grooming and willful blindness. I want to be clear here. We often think of grooming as something that only happens to the victim. It does a lot of the time. But in cases like this, the predator often grooms the entire environment. They groom the parent. They make themselves indispensable. And they become the hero so they can hide the villain. It's diabolical. And then there's the other side of that coin. I call it willful blindness. It's a heavy term, I know. It's a psychological act of choosing not to know because knowing would mean your entire world has to shatter. There's a cost to that. Today, we're going to peel back what I call the family mask. We're going to look past the stage interviews and the scripted answers to see exactly where the deception was allowed to live and why it was allowed to stay there for so long. I want to pause here for a second. This is a heavy case. I know it's a lot to take in. The details of the Madeline Soto case are, well, heavy. They're visceral. And I want to acknowledge that. But we aren't just here to talk about a headline. We're here to understand the why without the tragic details of what actually happened to Madeline. If you know this case, you know the details. I'm not talking about the details here. I am getting to the why. And by the end of this breakdown, you're going to know the specific cost of the silent enabler. These aren't just labels. They are the behavioral signs that someone is trading a child's safety for their own emotional comfort. It's like a padlock that explodes. That's the cost of silence. And this is my clinical analysis of that silent enabler. And the reason this matters, the reason why I'm making this video for you, is because these aren't just true crime patterns. These are the same psychological blueprint that people use to hide toxicity in families, in friendships, and even in workplaces every day. It happens way more than you realize. When we learn how to spot the cost of silence in a case this extreme, we become better at protecting the people in our own world. We learn that not knowing isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a survival tactic that costs way too much. For those of you who are new here, I'm John Cordray. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I've been practicing since 2007. And my goal with these breakdowns is always to take these complex and often dark human behaviors and then break them down so we can understand the psychology underneath. I want to offer a quick important note here. Everything that I'm sharing in this video is my professional speculation. It's based on public records and the trial testimony and the guilty verdict for Stearns and the behaviors that I observed in the footage. They're not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. I'm looking for the truth and the gaps between what was said and what was actually done. So let's open up the clinical file on the Madeline Soto case and see what happened in the house that silence built. Let's look at the how, because a predator like Stearns doesn't just walk into a home and start making demands. It's much more subtle than that. It's what I call the pathological integration. It's like a target, and that target is the victim. And the predator figures out how to get to that target. It finds a vulnerability gap and targets the struggling mother, Jennifer, by becoming the solution and the caregiver, starting to groom that process. He buys immunity. He becomes indispensable. Questioning him means losing the support system. And then it happens. Total access to the predator. The environment, the entire environment is fully groomed. It has complete access. When I look at Stearns' background and the way he positioned himself in Jenn Soto's life, I see someone who was looking for that vulnerability gap. Jenn, by all public accounts, seemed to be a mother who was struggling with her own health, perhaps struggling to manage the daily weight of life. And then walks in Stearns. He didn't just become a boyfriend, he became a solution. He stepped into the role of the helper, the caregiver, the one who handled everything. In clinical terms, this is a form of grooming. It's like I talked about. He targets the parent first. By becoming the hero to Jenn, he essentially bought himself immunity. Full access. When someone is solving your problems and taking a weight off your shoulders, you stop questioning their motives. In fact, you don't even think they have motives at all. You start to feel a sense of debt. And that debt, that's where the boundaries start to dissolve. He wasn't just a guest in that home. He had integrated himself so deeply into their daily routine that he became the very air they breathed. He was always there. He made himself indispensable so that questioning him would mean losing her own support. It's a brilliant, horrific and psychological maneuver. That's what predators do. They know their prey, they have a plan, and they execute it with precision. Now, let's talk about the home itself. As a therapist, one of the first things I look at in a family dynamics is the boundary map. In a healthy home, there are clear lines between adult spaces and child spaces, between adult responsibilities and child's needs. But in this household, those lines didn't just blur, they were erased. The slippery slope of the erasure of the boundaries, it started with an unconventional but helpful guest in Stearns. He was always constantly present, the indispensable fixture of the home. He did a lot of things, he cared a lot, and he was always helping. And then it led to managing life and space. Clinical neglect is taking intimate control of the child's space. That's neglect. That's the steady progression from unconventional to predator-friendly. And it happened right in front of Jenn. Chronologically, if we map this out, we see a slow, steady progression. It started with Stearns being involved, and he was always there, and then eventually he was the one managing Madeline's time, her space, and even her sleeping arrangement. When you have a grown man who's not a biological parent taking on a level of intimate control over a child's life, and the mother is stepping back to let it happen, it becomes the silent enabler. This is obviously a massive clinical red flag. Anybody would recognize this. We saw a shift from a home focused on a child's development to a home focused on an adult's convenience. The environment became predator-friendly for Stearns. In my world, we call this the erosion of protective factors. Every time a boundary was crossed and not corrected, the mask of a normal family became more important than the safety of the child inside it. It wasn't a sudden drop into chaos. It was a slow, deliberate walk down a dark hallway where each step away from safety was paved with, "It's fine. He's just helping." This is what a healthy boundary map looks like in a family. There are healthy protective factors. There's the adults in the family, they have their own space, and then there's the child space, and they have their own space. They are not crossed. But when the erosion of safety is in full force, the adult convenience becomes the primary factor. Every time a boundary was crossed and it wasn't corrected, it wasn't challenged, the mask of a normal family was prioritized over safety. I have to be honest with you. When I was looking at the timeline of how Stearns took over that household, how he essentially replaced the traditional parent-child bond with his own presence, it made me feel more than just a clinical interest. It made me feel a bit uneasy. Actually, uneasy isn't the right word. Horrified fits that really well. When I worked in a school system, I worked with kids with trauma and abuse in their life. And it was an honor to work with them. But it was also horrific, the stories that I've heard. This does not happen on an isolated event like a case like this. It happens way more than you think, way more than you want to think. And because of my line of work, as someone who had sat in front of families for years, the red flags in this case weren't just waving. They were screaming. They were bright neon signs saying, "This is not okay." And yet, the silence from Jenn was absolute. I find myself stopping and asking, how? How does a mother miss what the rest of the world sees so clearly in hindsight? It brings us back to that idea of willful blindness. It's not that she didn't see the red flags. It's that she couldn't afford to see them. To see them would mean she would have to act. She would have to lose her hero. She would have to face her own failure to protect. Willful blindness is not an excuse. It's avoidance. And when the red flags are screaming everywhere, the defense mechanism is simply to put an umbrella. It's raining. The red flags are raining. I need an umbrella to protect myself. Not knowing isn't an accident. It's a survival tactic. Seeing the truth means the world shatters. So intuition is to shut down to protect the hero. Do you see how blinded that is? This is the part that's so hard to wrap our heads around. It's easier to think that she didn't know than to think that she chose not to know. But we're here to look at the why behind the silence, the clinical mechanics of how a person shuts down their own intuition to maintain a lie. I know this is deep and it's a lot to process. We're going into territory that most true crime coverage just skims over. And if you value these deep dives into the why behind the what, if you want to keep exploring the psychological blueprints of these cases from a professional perspective, I would love for you to consider joining as a channel member. Click that join button and you'll get some cool perks. Now let's talk about the verdict. Stearns was found guilty. And when that news broke, there was a collective sigh of not relief, but a sense of justice. As a clinician, I'm looking at something a little different though. I'm looking at the fact that he didn't just snap. This wasn't a moment of lost control, something that happened out of nowhere. When you look at the evidence presented in the trial, what you see is a man whose behavior was meticulously calculated. He wore a mask, a very specific one. He wasn't the monster in the bushes. He was the helpful boyfriend. He was the guy who took the trash out and helped with homework. That mask wasn't just for the neighbors. It was specifically designed to manipulate Jenn. From my clinical lens, I see a predator who understood Jenn's psychological blind spots better than she did. He fed her exactly what she needed to feel secure so that he could do exactly what he wanted. It was a trade. He provided the stability that she felt that she lacked, and in exchange, he expected and received total access. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous people don't always look dangerous. They don't look like predators. Sometimes they just look ordinary, convenient, helpful. Now we have to address the biggest elephant in the room, the public speculation that Jenn was complicit. I see it in the comments. I see it in the headlines. People are angry and they're upset, and they are justified for feeling so. They want to know how she couldn't have known. But as a therapist, I don't find judgment to be a very useful tool for understanding the human mind. Instead, I look at it through the lens of willful blindness that I talked about. I actually see this more than you might realize. It's a defense mechanism where a person refuses to see because the truth is so heavy and it's so shattering that if they acknowledged it, their entire reality would crumble. If Jenn admits to herself, even for a second, what was happening under her roof and to her daughter, then she has to face the fact that she failed in the most fundamental way as a parent can. So the mind does something interesting and terrifying. It just stops processing the evidence. Now, she wasn't just a bystander in this. From a clinical perspective, she was an essential part of the environment that Stearns needed to operate. He needed a blind partner, and she, for whatever reason, needed to stay blind. Think about the interviews where she defends her routine, even when that routine was clearly the problem. Even when it was the very thing that put Madeline in danger, she clings to it. Why? because that routine is the narrative. It's the story of a normal family. In her mind, she was protecting that narrative over the child because the narrative was her only source of safety. It's a devastating clinical cycle. You can go back and look at the police interviews again. I actually had to watch them a few times because something felt so off that I couldn't put my finger on it at first. And then it hit me. It's her affect. It's totally flat. She's talking about her daughter, a situation that should be the most high-stakes, emotionally volatile moment of a human life, especially for a mother. She was reciting the details like she's reading a grocery list. This is the expected response or reaction from a mother whose child was the victim. And yet, the observed affect was flat and distant. She wore this, she went there, I did this. That was her routine. That's how she recited it. This is the result of long-term numbing to avoid the wrongness of her reality. It's that crescendo effect of the nervous system that is flat, and then it heightens, and then it's denial. Most people see that and think she's cold or guilty. But as an LPC, I see someone who has practiced not feeling for a very, very long time. This is what happens when you live in a state of constant internal conflict. You have to numb yourself so you don't feel the wrongness of your own life. It's like she's narrating a movie she's watching rather than a life she's actually living. She has distanced herself so far from her own reality that the victimhood of her own child can't break through the fog. That's not just shock. That's a long-term psychological habit of turning off the light so you don't have to see the mess. Hey friends, if you value this kind of deep dive, if you want to keep sharpening your psychological eye and learning how to see the patterns behind the headlines, make sure to karate chop that subscribe button. This is the part of the case that I keep coming back to in my mind. There is one specific piece of evidence regarding their partnership, one detail about how they communicated after the fact, that truly changes how we have to view Jenn's role in all of this. It moves us past the not knowing and into something much more deliberate. This was the exact moment when a transactional ecosystem was born. The predator was Stearns, and his goal was total access. The enabler was Jenn, and her goal was the illusion of stability. And for Stearns, his mask was the helpful boyfriend. For Jenn, her mask was a normal family. She just wanted a normal family. For Stearns, the currency was he provided the daily convenience. That's how he bought into it. For Jenn, her currency was she traded away the boundaries and looked elsewhere. It's a tragic transactional ecosystem that was happening right in that house. We've looked at the evidence, we've looked at the interviews, and we've looked at the guilty verdict for Stearns. But when we start to wrap up this clinical file, I want to step back. I want to look at the macro lesson here. Because if we just walk away now thinking this is a one-off tragedy involving a monster and a clueless mother, we missed the point entirely. This case isn't just about a predator. It's the safety of the status quo. Human beings are hardwired for stability. We crave predictable routines. That's why we have them. But when parents stop being the gatekeepers to avoid conflict, they create a psychological void. Predators don't break in, they are invited in by the silence. This creates a tragic void, a vacuum, and that's the status quo. We need to believe that our world is predictable and that the people in our homes are who they say they are. But sometimes that craving for stability becomes a trap or a void. In that household, peace was bought at the highest price possible. Jenn Soto, from a clinical perspective, seemed to value the appearance of a functioning household, a normal family, more than the actual safety of the child within it. When I say that a lack of healthy boundaries creates a vacuum, this is what I mean. Healthy boundaries are like a home security system. They tell us who is allowed in, what behavior is acceptable, and when a line has been crossed. When those boundaries are eroded, when a parent stops being the gatekeeper, the protector, and starts being a bystander, it creates that psychological void. And predators like Stearns, they're all too happy to fill that void. They don't just break in, they don't sneak in, they're invited in. It's a devastating lesson in how our own desire to avoid conflict, to avoid making a scene, or to avoid losing our own support system can create a space where darkness thrives. I have to tell you, when I was sitting with this case, I kept thinking about all the small silences that led up to this big one. It's never just one thing. It's 1,000 tiny little choices to look the other way. It's the, oh, he's just being helpful here, and Madeline is just being sensitive. Each one of those thoughts is a brick in the wall of willful blindness. From my chair, I see people struggling with this every day. We ignore our gut because our gut is telling us something that would require us to change our entire life. And change is terrifying. But what this case shows us, what it screams at us, is that the cost of not changing, the cost of staying silent to protect your own comfort, is always paid by someone else. Usually the person with the least power in the room. We have to ask ourselves, are we maintaining a status quo in our own lives that is actually a vacuum? Are we allowing boundaries to blur because it's easier than having a hard conversation? It's a heavy question, I know. It's not meant to make you feel anxious, but to make you feel aware. Awareness is the only thing that breaks the vacuum. As we close this clinical file on the Madeline Soto case, there's one thought that I can't seem to shake. When a predator like Stearns is found guilty and sent away, the legal system considers the book closed. Justice has been served. But in my world, the book is still wide open because we're left with the mother. We're left with the willful blindness. And we have to ask a question that doesn't have an easy answer in the courtroom. In a world where the red flags are everywhere, where the boundaries were non-existent, and the grooming was happening in plain sight, is not knowing actually a valid excuse? Or is there a point where not knowing stops being an accident and starts becoming a choice? That is something to think about.